The slaves were reduced to property. They were chattel property. No other system of slavery did that except American slavery.
The Atlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas was different from any other type of slavery.
The United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it.
That's complete nonsense.
The history of slavery is one of the darkest chapters in human civilization. But what most of us were taught in school is only a fraction of the full story. Today, we are going to examine the complete, documented, fact-based history of slavery, not to minimize its horror, but to understand it fully. Because the truth is more complex, more global, and more human than any single narrative can capture. Slavery was not invented in America. It was not exclusively practiced by white Europeans. Black people were not the only ones enslaved, and the vast majority of Americans never owned a single slave. These are not opinions. These are documented historical facts, and understanding them does not diminish the suffering of any enslaved person. It deepens our understanding of how this institution shaped the entire world. This is the untold history of slavery in chronological order, from the ancient world to the American Civil War. Chapter 1. The Ancient World, 3500 BC to 500 AD. Slavery did not begin in the American South. It did not begin with European colonialism. Slavery is, tragically, one of the oldest human institutions, documented across virtually every ancient civilization on Earth. The earliest written records of slavery come from ancient Sumer in modern-day Iraq, around 3500 BC. Cuneiform tablets from this period record the buying and selling of slaves as common economic transactions. According to the Encyclopedia of Ancient History, slaves in Mesopotamia were used in agriculture, construction, domestic service, and temple work. In ancient Egypt, slavery was practiced for thousands of years. While the popular image of Hebrew slaves building the pyramids is debated by scholars, what is not debated is that Egypt held large numbers of enslaved Africans, Nubians, Syrians, and prisoners of war. According to the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt, slavery was a legal and normalized institution throughout the New Kingdom period, from approximately 1550 to 1070 BC. Ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, was also deeply dependent on slave labor. At the height of Athenian power, historians estimate that slaves made up between 30 and 40% of the total population. According to classicist Moses Finley in his landmark work, Ancient Slavery and Modern Ideology, published in 1980, the Athenian economy would have been impossible without enslaved labor. Slaves in Greece came from all over the known world, from Africa, Asia Minor, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. Rome expanded this model dramatically. At the peak of the Roman Empire, scholars estimate there were between 2 and 4 million slaves in Italy alone, representing roughly 35% of the Italian population. According to historian Keith Bradley, in Slavery and Society at Rome, published in 1994, Roman slaves included people from Britain, Gaul, Germany, North Africa, Greece, Egypt, and the Middle East. Slavery in Rome was not based on race. It was based on conquest. In sub-Saharan Africa, slavery also existed long before European contact. The trans-Saharan slave trade, documented by scholars including Paul Lovejoy in Transformations in Slavery, A History of Slavery in Africa, published in 2000, moved enslaved Africans northward into North Africa and the Arab world for centuries before the Atlantic trade began. In East Asia, slavery was practiced in ancient China, Korea, and Japan. The Chinese institution of slavery, documented in the Zhou Li and other ancient texts, included debt slavery, war captives, and hereditary servitude. The point is clear. By the time European colonizers began crossing the Atlantic Ocean, slavery had already been a global human institution for more than 5,000 years. Chapter 2. Medieval Slavery, 500 AD to 1400 AD. As the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, the institution of slavery did not disappear. It transformed. The Arab slave trade is one of the longest-running and least discussed slave trades in history. Beginning as early as the 7th century AD and continuing in some regions into the 20th century, the Arab slave trade transported an estimated 10 to 18 million enslaved Africans across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean into the Arab world, Persia, and South Asia. According to scholar Ronald Siegel, in Islam's Black Slaves, the Other Black Diaspora, published in 2001, this trade predated the Atlantic slave trade by centuries and operated on an enormous scale. Both men and women were enslaved. with women frequently taken as concubines and domestic servants, and men used as soldiers and laborers. In West Africa, powerful kingdoms including Ghana, Mali, and Songhai participated actively in the slave trade, both as victims and as sellers. According to historian John Thornton, in Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, published in 1998, African elites sold enslaved war captives and criminals to Arab and later European traders as an established economic practice. This is a critical and often omitted fact. The transatlantic slave trade was only possible because African kingdoms were willing participants in the supply chain. In Europe, Viking raiders from Scandinavia conducted massive slave-taking operations from the 8th to 11th centuries. The word slave itself is derived from the word Slav, reflecting the enormous numbers of Eastern European Slavic peoples who were enslaved during this period. According to historian Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings, published in 2020, the slave trade was central to the Viking economy. Enslaved people were taken from Britain, Ireland, France, and Eastern Europe and sold across the known world, including to Arab merchants. The medieval Islamic world also maintained legal frameworks for slavery. Islamic law permitted the enslavement of non-Muslims taken in war, and a thriving trade in enslaved Africans, Europeans, and Central Asians operated throughout the medieval period. According to Bernard Lewis in Race and Slavery in the Middle East, published in 1990, slavery was so embedded in medieval Arab culture that it persisted legally in some Arab nations until the mid-20th century. By the time the European age of exploration began in the 1400s, slavery was not a new invention. It was a global institution with thousands of years of history, practiced on every inhabited continent on Earth. Chapter 3. The Rise of the Atlantic Slave Trade, 1400s to 1600s. The Atlantic slave trade began with Portugal. In the 1440s, Portuguese explorers sailing down the West African coast began capturing and trading enslaved Africans. The first documented shipment of enslaved Africans to Europe occurred in 1444 when Portuguese captain Lanzarote de Freitas, I'm sure I butchered the hell out of that. Anyway, he brought 235 enslaved people to Lagos, Portugal. This is recorded in the chronicles of Gomes y Yanes de Zurara, and is considered the official beginning of the European Atlantic slave trade. Portugal quickly established trading posts along the African coast, negotiating with local African kings and chiefs who provided enslaved people in exchange for goods, including textiles, weapons, and metals. This point bears repeating. African rulers were active and willing participants in the early slave trade. According to historian Hugh Thomas in The Slave Trade, The Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade, 1440 to 1870, published in 1997, the Portuguese could not have operated without the cooperation of African coastal kingdoms such as Benin, Dahomey, and the Ashanti Confederation. Spain entered the trade shortly after, and following Christopher Columbus's voyages beginning in 1492, the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas exploded. The indigenous populations of the Caribbean and Central America were devastated by European diseases, and Spanish colonizers turned to African slave labor to work their mines and plantations. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the non-European world between Portugal and Spain, cementing their dominance over early Atlantic trade routes. By the early 1500s, the transatlantic slave trade was an established economic system. England, France, and the Netherlands entered the trade in the 1600s, each establishing their own slave trading companies. The British Royal African Company, chartered in 1660, was granted a monopoly on the English slave trade. According to historian Marcus Wood in Blind Memory, Visual Representations of Slavery in England and America, published in 2000, the Royal African Company transported more enslaved Africans to the Americas than any other single entity in the history of the slave trade. The scale of this trade was enormous. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, maintained by Emory University and available at slavevoyages.org, approximately 12.5 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic between 1500 and 1900. Of these, an estimated 10.7 million survived the crossing, known as the Middle Passage. Of those, the United States received fewer than 400,000, less than 4% of the total. The remainder, nearly 2 million people, perished at sea. Chapter 4. The Atlantic Slave Trade at its peak, 1600s to 1800s. The height of the Atlantic slave trade ran roughly from 1650 to 1808, when Britain and the United States officially banned the importation of enslaved people. During this period, the trade was the engine of massive wealth generation across Europe and the Americas. The trade operated in a triangle. European ships carried manufactured goods, textiles, guns, and alcohol to the West African coast. There, they traded those goods with African kings and merchants for enslaved people. The enslaved were then transported across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage, packed into the holds of ships in conditions of unimaginable suffering. Those who survived were sold in the Americas. The ships then returned to Europe loaded with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities produced by enslaved labor. The destinations of enslaved Africans in the Americas are important to understand. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, approximately 40% of all enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic went to Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony. About 17% went to the Spanish colonies of the Caribbean and South America. British Caribbean colonies, including Jamaica and Barbados, received approximately 18%. The territory that would become the United States received approximately 3.6%, roughly 388,000 enslaved people, directly from Africa. This means that while American slavery was brutal and consequential, the United States received a relatively small portion of the total transatlantic slave trade. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans went to South America and the Caribbean, where sugar and coffee plantations had voracious labor demands. Within Africa itself, the trade had devastating consequences. Powerful kingdoms including Dahomey in present-day Benin, the Ashanti Confederation in present-day Ghana, and the Oyo Empire in present-day Nigeria became wealthy by raiding neighboring peoples and selling them to European traders. According to historian Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, published in 1972, the internal African slave trade depopulated vast regions of West and Central Africa and destabilized societies for generations. The economic stakes were enormous for everyone involved. British merchant firms, French plantation owners, Portuguese traders, African kings, and American colonists all had financial interests in maintaining the system. Chapter 5: Slavery in Colonial America, 1600s to 1776. When English colonists arrived in Virginia in the early 1600s, their initial labor force was not African, it was European. Indentured servitude was the dominant labor system in early colonial America. Under this system, poor Europeans, primarily English, Irish, and Scottish men and women, signed contracts agreeing to work for a colonial master for a set number of years, typically 4 to 7, in exchange for passage to America, food, shelter, and the promise of land or money upon completing their term. According to historian Edmund Morgan in American Slavery, American Freedom, published in 1975, in the early and mid-1600s, the majority of the labor force in Virginia and Maryland consisted of white indentured servants, not African slaves. Conditions for indentured servants were often brutal. They were bought and sold, could be physically punished, had no freedom of movement, and could have their contracts extended for any infraction. The Irish experience deserves particular attention. During and after the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 1650s, tens of thousands of Irish men, women, and children were transported to the West Indies and American colonies as forced laborers. According to historian Sean O'Callaghan in To Hell or Barbados, The Ethnic Cleansing of Ireland, published in 2000, this mass transportation of Irish people constitutes one of the most overlooked episodes of forced labor in the English-speaking world. While the legal status of Irish transportees differed in some ways from chattel slavery, their conditions in the sugar fields of Barbados and the Carolinas were in many cases indistinguishable from it. Native Americans were also enslaved in colonial America. According to historian Alan Gallay in The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the American South, published in 2002, between 1670 and 1715, more Native Americans were exported from South Carolina as slaves than Africans were imported. Tens of thousands of Native Americans were enslaved by English colonists throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The shift toward African chattel slavery accelerated after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when a multiracial coalition of indentured servants and poor freedmen nearly overthrew the Virginia colonial government. Alarmed by this show of interracial solidarity among the laboring poor, Virginia planters began systematically replacing indentured servants with African slaves, who could be held in permanent hereditary bondage and more easily distinguished from the free population by race. According to historian Edmund Morgan, this was a calculated political decision as much as an economic one. By 1700, African chattel slavery had become the foundation of the Southern colonial economy. But the story of who held enslaved people is more complicated than is often taught. Here's a wrinkle worth knowing. Anthony Johnson isn't actually the earliest documented case. 15 years earlier, in 1640, a man named John Punch became the first person in the Virginia colony documented as sentenced to slavery for life. He and two white indentured servants ran away together, and when they were caught, the two white servants had years added to their contracts, but Punch alone was sentenced to serve for the rest of his life. His owner was a white planter, Hugh Gwynn. So the Johnson v. Kaser case in 1655 was the first time a court enforced lifetime slavery in a civil property dispute. But Punch's case, 15 years earlier, is the first documented instance of race-based slavery for life in the colony. Chapter 6. Slavery in the United States, 1776 to 1860. The United States declared independence in 1776 with the words that all men are created equal, while simultaneously permitting the institution of slavery. This contradiction was not lost on the founders, many of whom were deeply conflicted about it. Some, like John Adams, opposed slavery personally. Others, like Thomas Jefferson, owned hundreds of enslaved people while writing about liberty. By 1790, the first federal census recorded approximately 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, that number had grown to approximately 4 million. This growth was driven not by continued importation. The international slave trade was banned in 1808, but by natural increase and the domestic slave trade between states. Now, let us examine one of the most important and misunderstood statistics in American history. Who actually owned slaves? According to the 1860 U.S. Census, the last census taken before the Civil War, approximately 393,000 individuals in the United States owned enslaved people. The total free population of the United States in 1860 was approximately 27 million people. This means that slaveholders represented roughly 1.4% of the total U.S. population, less than 1.5%. Even if we count only white Southern households, fewer than 1 in 3 Southern white families owned any enslaved people at all. According to historian James McPherson in Battle Cry of Freedom, published in 1988, the majority of white Southerners had no direct economic stake in slavery as slaveholders, though many benefited indirectly from the slave economy. The concentration of slave ownership was extreme. Large plantations with 50 or more enslaved people were owned by fewer than 10,000 individuals. These large planters represented the planter aristocracy that dominated Southern politics and culture, but they were a tiny fraction of even the Southern white population. Now for a fact that is almost entirely absent from mainstream American history education. Black Americans owned slaves too. Free black slaveholders existed in every Southern state that permitted slavery. According to historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. in his article, Slavery and the Making of America, published by PBS, in 1830, there were approximately 3,700 free black slaveholders in the United States, owning a total of approximately 12,000 enslaved people. The largest concentration was in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Virginia. Some of these black slaveholders were people who had purchased family members to protect them from harsher masters, a compassionate act within a horrifying system. But others were genuine slaveholders operating plantations for profit. Andrew Durnford of Louisiana owned over 70 enslaved people and operated a successful sugar plantation. William Ellison of South Carolina, born into slavery himself, became one of the wealthiest men in his county and owned more than 60 enslaved people by the time of the Civil War. According to historians Michael P. Johnson and James L. Rourke in Black Masters, a free family of color in the Old South, published in 1984, these men participated fully in the slave economy. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a documented fact, and ignoring it distorts our understanding of how slavery actually functioned as an institution, one that was ultimately about power and economics, not simply about race. Chapter 7. Native American Slaveholders and Enslaved Native Americans. The relationship between Native Americans and slavery is another chapter that is almost never taught in American schools, and it cuts in multiple directions. First, Native Americans were themselves enslaved by European colonizers on a massive scale. As noted earlier, historian Alan Gallay has documented that between 1670 and 1715, more Native Americans were exported from South Carolina as slaves than Africans were imported. Native American slaves were sent to Caribbean sugar plantations and used as domestic servants and laborers throughout the colonies. But Native Americans also owned enslaved Africans. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, adopted the institution of chattel slavery from their white neighbors and became significant slaveholders in the early 19th century. According to historian Taya Miles in Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom, published in 2005, the Cherokee Nation owned approximately 1,500 enslaved people by 1809, growing to nearly 4,000 by the start of the Civil War. When the 5 civilized tribes were forcibly removed from their lands in the 1830s, along what became known as the Trail of Tears, they brought their enslaved people with them to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole slaveholders established plantations in Indian Territory and continued practicing chattel slavery until the end of the Civil War. After the war, the United States required the 5 tribes to grant citizenship to their formerly enslaved people, known as freedmen, as a condition of new treaties. This history of Native American slaveholding remains one of the most underexamined aspects of American slavery. Chapter 8, The Abolitionist Movement, 1700s to 1865. Slavery was not ended because it collapsed on its own. It was ended because thousands of courageous people, black and white, American and European, religious and secular, fought for decades to abolish. The abolitionist movement began in earnest in the late 18th century, and it was genuinely multiracial from the start. In Britain, the Quakers were among the first organized groups to oppose slavery on moral grounds, passing resolutions against it as early as 1688. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in London in 1787 by a group that included both white abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp, and formerly enslaved Africans like Olaudah Equiano, whose memoir, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, published in 1789, became one of the most powerful abolitionist documents ever written. William Wilberforce, a British member of Parliament, led the political campaign to end the British slave trade for nearly 2 decades. His efforts resulted in the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which abolished the Atlantic slave trade for British subjects. Britain then went further, abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. In America, the abolitionist movement grew steadily from the late 1700s onward. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery in Maryland around 1818, escaped to freedom and became the most powerful anti-slavery voice in American history. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845, shocked readers with its detailed account of the brutality of slavery. Douglass worked alongside white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator in 1831, and Wendell Phillips. Harriet Tubman escaped slavery in 1849 and returned to the South at least 13 times, personally guiding approximately 70 enslaved people to freedom along the Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses organized by both black and white abolitionists. According to Kate Clifford Larson in Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, published in 2004, Tubman never lost a single person on her missions. Here's a lesser-known detail. In 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free black man, but marriage didn't change her own status. Under Maryland law, she remained legally enslaved the entire time. She didn't gain her own freedom until she escaped in 1849. Tubman's very first rescue mission wasn't a stranger. It was her own family. In December 1850, she learned her niece, Keziah Boley, and her 2 children were about to be sold at auction. Keziah's husband, John Boley, a free black man, placed a winning bid at the courthouse auction for his own wife and kids. While the auctioneer stepped away, the family slipped off, paddled up the Chesapeake by canoe, and met Tubman in Baltimore, who guided them on to freedom in Philadelphia. Sojourner Truth, a formerly enslaved woman from New York, became a nationally known speaker for both abolition and women's rights. David Walker, a free black man from Boston, published his incendiary Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1829, calling for enslaved people to resist their bondage. White abolitionists were also essential to the movement. John Brown, a white man from Connecticut, devoted his life and ultimately gave it to the violent overthrow of slavery, leading raids on pro-slavery settlements in Kansas and the famous raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman from New England, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, which sold more than 300,000 copies in its first year and turned millions of Northern readers against slavery. When Abraham Lincoln met Stowe, he reportedly said, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." The abolitionist movement was not black or white. It was a coalition of human beings who recognized slavery as a moral abomination and were willing to sacrifice their reputations, their freedom, and their lives to end it. Chapter 9, The Civil War and Emancipation, 1861 to 1865. By 1860, the United States could no longer contain the contradiction at its core. The election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, triggered the secession of 11 Southern states, which formed the Confederate States of America. Their declaration of secession made clear that the preservation of slavery was their primary motivation. The Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, in his famous Cornerstone speech delivered in March 1861, stated explicitly that slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederacy and that the subjugation of the African race was the proper condition of that race. The Civil War began in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Over the next 4 years, approximately 620,000 soldiers died, more Americans than in any other war in the nation's history. The majority of Union soldiers were white men from the North. They were joined by approximately 180,000 black soldiers who served in the United States colored troops. According to historian Joseph Gladar in Forged in Battle, the Civil War Alliance of Black Soldiers and White Officers, published in 1990, black soldiers participated in more than 400 military engagements and were crucial to the Union's ultimate victory. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. While limited in its immediate legal effect, it transformed the moral character of the war and paved the way for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December 1865, which formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. The Civil War cost the nation dearly, but it resolved the central question that the founders had refused to answer. Slavery was incompatible with a democratic republic. Chapter 10, Legacy: Why the Full Truth Matters. The full history of slavery is uncomfortable for everyone. It implicates not just white Europeans and white Americans, but Arab traders, African kings, Native American nations, and free black slaveholders. It reveals that the institution was global, ancient, and embedded in human civilization across cultures and centuries. None of this diminishes the specific horror of American chattel slavery, which was uniquely brutal in its racial, hereditary nature and its legal dehumanization of an entire group of people. The suffering of the millions who were enslaved in the United States was real, and its legacy in wealth disparities and generational trauma persists today. But understanding the full history does something important. It refuses to reduce this enormous human tragedy to a simple story with simple villains. It forces us to confront the capacity for evil that exists across human cultures, and it honors the full complexity of the people who suffered, the people who perpetuated it, and the people who fought to end it. When we teach only a fraction of this history, we do a disservice to everyone. We allow myths to take the place of facts. We make it easier to use history as a political weapon rather than a tool for genuine understanding. The documented facts are clear. Slavery was ancient and global. Many peoples and nations participated in it. The overwhelming majority of Americans never owned a slave. Black Americans were not the only people enslaved in America, and people of every background, black, white, and everything in between, fought and died to end it. That is the full truth. And the full truth is the only foundation strong enough to build a more just future. As always, much love to each and every one of you. And until next time, I'm out. The following sources were used in the production of this documentary. All are publicly available and verifiable.